Hi guys, thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to be testing an API with Postman. So I've written a simple bakery API that has a few endpoints. With this API, you can check the status of the API, view all menu items at the bakery, view a specific menu item, create, read, update, and delete a single order, and then read a list of all orders that have been created. This API was created with Node, Express, and MySQL, and it runs on your local computer. I've included instructions for getting it set up and documentation for using it, and also all the Postman tests that I'm going to be running on GitHub. I've linked to that resource down below if you'd like to check it out. Okay, so getting started, I've written some manual tests in Postman just to make sure that the API is working correctly. So going into our manual tests, my first test is going to be the API status test. And this is just a test to make sure that the API is up and running. You can see that I'm hitting the status endpoint here and we're sending a GET request to it. So see what happens, and we get a status 200 back, so that's great. Okay, and so for our next request, we're going to get all menu items. You can see that we are sending a GET request to the menu endpoint, and if we send that request, then we get all of our menu items back. We have got 5 different menu items. So we've got a chocolate chip cookie, a sugar cookie, a lemon cookie, a chocolate cupcake, and a vanilla cupcake. And we can even filter by the type of menu item it is. So if we add an item type here and we put in cupcake for the value, then we get our cupcakes back. We get a chocolate cupcake and a vanilla cupcake. We can also change this up to be cookie. And if we do that, then we get our cookies back. We get the chocolate chip cookie, the sugar cookie, and the lemon cookie. But if we say put in an item type that doesn't exist, like pie, say, then we get a 404 not found, and we also get an error that the item type was not found in the menu. So that seems to be working. Okay, and so for our next test, we're going to try to get a single menu item back. So we're going to send a GET request to our menu endpoint, and we're going to send a path variable with the item ID that we want to get back. So in this case, our item ID is set to 3. So if we send this request, we do get our single item back. So we're getting a lemon cookie back, and we've got a status 200, which is great. Now, if we try to say access menu or item ID that doesn't exist, so we know that there are 5 items in our menu. If we try to get, item ID number 30, say, we're going to get a 404 and an error saying that the item ID is not found in menu. So if we change this back again to say 3, then we're all good again. We get a 200 and we still get our lemon cookie back. So that is working as expected. All right, so moving right along, let's create an order. So in order to do that, we need to send a post request over to our orders endpoint. And we also need to make sure to include a JSON body in the request. So as you can see, I'm in the body section, I'm sending JSON, and we also need to include 2 properties. So we need to include a customer name, and I'm using the Faker library that's included with Postman just to create a random full name for myself, and also an item ID. So we're sending over 3. That should be the lemon cookie. So I send this over, I get our order back. So we've got order ID number 10, we've got our customer name Bobby, we've got the item ID 3, and we've got the lemon cookie. And we're also getting a 201 created response back, so that's great. As I mentioned, we need to make sure to include both of these properties in both the customer name and the item ID in our JSON body. So if I say leave off the item ID and just send over a customer name, then I'm going to get a 400 bad request back saying that the customer name and item ID cannot be null. And just, for completion's sake, if I send over an item ID and no customer name, then I'm still going to get that same bad, bad request back, that 400. So, we can't have any of those properties null. So I fix it and I send it again. Now we get 201 back because we're creating this, and everything is working back to normal. This is the order that we've just created. So that's working. All right, so now let us get an order. So in order to get an order, we need to send a get request to our orders endpoint, and we also need to send a path variable with the order ID that we want to get back. So we just created order ID number 10, so let's go ahead and see if I can get this back. I send that request over, and indeed I get order ID 10 back, and that was Bobby that we created, and he ordered the lemon cookie. So that is working. If I try to say, and that's we get a 200, so that's awesome. So let's say I try to access an order ID that doesn't exist. So I don't think I've got 100 orders in here. If I send this, then I'm going to get a 404 not found, and the order ID is not found in orders. So that is working. If I change it back to 10, then I should get Bobby back. So that is working just as we want. Okay, and so now let's try to get all of our orders. So in order to do that, we need to send a get request to our orders endpoint. And if we send this request, then we get all of the orders that we've created so far. So we get order 10, Bobby, and we get 11, Krista. And those are the two last orders that we created. And you can see that we're getting a 200 back, so that is great. Okay, and so now let's try to update an order. So in order to update an order, we need to send a patch request over to our orders endpoint, and we need to specify the order ID that we want as a path variable. So we created order ID number 11 last time, and that was Krista. And if we also need to, very important, to send a JSON body over. And so this is it. We're in the body section, we're in JSON, and we need to send two properties. We need to send either the customer name or the item ID. And I'm using the Faker library that Postman includes. So if I include, I can include one of these properties or both of them, but I have to include either the customer name or the item ID for this to work. So if I send this over, this is a lemon cookie. So we're just expecting, Krista's name to be changed with this. So yes. So now we're getting Gloria back, and we get response 200, and it's still the lemon cookie. We can go ahead and we can change Gloria now. If we want to say, I think this will be the chocolate cupcake that we're changing this to, and now we're changing Gloria's name as well. If we send that over, now we've got Ronald with the chocolate cupcake. And as I mentioned, we can choose to include, we don't have to include both of these, we can just include one. So if we just include sort of the customer name, then we're going to be changing Ronald's name to something else. So if we do that, now we get Joel back. And we can also, we put the item ID back, and we change that to say 5, but we take out the customer name. Then we're going to have, I'm expecting to get Joel back, but he should order the vanilla cupcake this time. So let's send that over. And yes, we've got Joel with a vanilla cupcake. And as I mentioned, this will throw an error if I don't include JSON body. So if I don't include anything, I get a 400 bad request and an indication to please provide the customer name or the ID. So I put those back, and I just change this to 1, say. Now everything is working. I get a 200 back, and I have a new name and a new ID. So that's working. There is one last thing that I wanted to mention about updating an order. So as I mentioned, when we send this patch request, we need to send a path variable with the order ID that we want to update. So if we sent this, we were, I think, working with order ID 11. If we sent that over, then we will get, this will work just fine. But if we add an order ID that isn't in our isn't in our orders already, then we get a 404 not found. So we get an error that the order ID is not found in orders. So you need to make sure that the order ID actually exists. So if I change this back to 11, say, then we're all good and we get 200 and we've just changed, we've changed our name and we've updated it with the chocolate cupcake. All right, so finally for our delete an order. So if we want to delete an order, then we need to send a delete request to the order's endpoint and we need to specify the order ID that we want to delete. So I think we were working with order ID number 11 last time. And if I sent this over, then I get a 204, no content. So it doesn't return anything. It just will delete the order. And so now to see if it's deleted, I can try to send this request again, and I should get a 404 that our order isn't found. That order not found in orders, which makes sense because we just deleted it. So, and if we go back to view all orders and we send this again, we can see that, in fact, our orders end at 10. So if I go back and try to now delete order ID number 10, then we should get things working again. We should get that 204, no content, back working again. So that's great. So, sending manual tests is all well and good when you're building your API, but sometimes it's nice to just be able to run automated tests when you're pretty sure that everything is working as expected. Fortunately, Postman makes it really easy to do this. So, I've created some tests that for our different requests. And so here, looking at our check API status, I've created a test that's just going to check if the status code that we get back is 200. And so if I send this, then, well, I see that the status is 200, but then if I go into test results, I can see that that test is passing. Okay, so for our next test, we want to see if we can get all of our menu items back. So I've created a test for this. Um, and so we're sending a GET request to our menu endpoint. And as you can see, going back to our parameters, this is basically what it is. And if we look at our tests, if we go into our tests, basically our first test is just testing to see if the status code that we get back is 200. It should return a status code 200 when we send this request. And then I'm sending another test. I'm doing another test. So the other test is basically to see if we have a cookie and a cupcake item in our menu list. So this is basically assuming that we will always have at least one cookie and one cupcake in our menu. So I'm grabbing, the data that we're getting back from the response, and then I am setting a cookie variable, and that's going to be equal to the first cookie that we find in our response, and then the cupcake is going to be equal to the value of the first cupcake that we have in our response. And so that's basically, we're just checking to see if the cookie is an object, which it should be, and that its item type is equal to cookie, and also for our cupcake, that the cupcake is an object and that its item type is equal to cupcake. So let's go ahead and run this. And if we go and check into our tests, we see that both of those tests pass. that's great. One other thing that I should mention is that I'm also, you know, setting a global variable here. This is I'm grabbing the first item, the item ID um, of the first item in our menu list, and I'm going to be using that in a future test. So just wanted to tell you that just so that when we move forward, you'll know what I'm talking about, and you'll know where that variable came from. So I wanted to quickly address one of the things that we talked about in our test. So we were expecting a response 200, and this should pass. But it's also important to make sure that your test will fail. So let's say if I expect a response 201 back, you'll see that our first test will fail because we're getting a response 200 back. So always a good thing to double check to make sure that your test will fail. Similarly, we can go through and see if our cookie and cupcake item test will fail. So let's say I expect, I know I don't have pie in my menu, so let's put in pie here. So we're expecting the item ID of cookie to be pie. And if we do that, we can see that our cookie and cupcake test fails. So we change this back to cookie, and let's say we want to expect to get ice cream back for our cupcake. Then if we go ahead and send that, we can still see that our item type is incorrect. We should be getting cupcake, but we've put an ice cream here, so that's why this test is failing. So if we go ahead and change it back to cupcake and send this test, then it's passing again and everything is good. So just wanted to mention that it's also important to make sure that the test will fail as well as pass. All right, so let's see how our get a menu item test is set up. So basically, I'm just testing to see if I get a status 200 back, which is what I should get back. But if you'll recall from from our previous test, I set a global variable for the item ID, and I'm using that global variable here as a path variable just so that, if I get from our last test, if I get a menu item, I can actually search for that same menu item. So if I run this test, going to our tests, I can see that that is passing. And if I change this to say 201 and try to get that, then it will fail because it's expecting a 200 response. So making that pass again, and we're all good. We've got green. Okay, so now let's take a look at our create and order test. So in this test, I am just running a test to make sure that I get back a 201 response back from the server, which is what we'll expect. And also, I am setting a global variable order ID from the response that I get back from my request. Also, I want to note that with my request, I'm sending over a JSON body. So this is in our body section. We're sending over JSON, and I'm sending over the customer name. I'm using the Faker library for that, just to generate a random full name for our customer. And I'm sending over an item ID as well. And the item ID is the global variable that we got earlier from our get all menu items test. So over here, you can see that's where we're setting that global variable. So if we go ahead and send this test, we can see that go into our tests, we can see that we get a status code 201 back. Also important to make sure that the test will fail. So I set this as a 200. You can see that the test fails. So you can set it back to 201 and we're passing again. So all is good. Okay, so for our get and order test, basically I'm just checking to see that we're going to get a status code 200 back. So, but one small trick here is that I am using the order ID that we created from our create and order test, and that's that global variable, and then using that as our path variable. So let's go ahead and see how this works. So as you can see, we get from the order that we created, we get our order ID. Um, and we also get the customer name, item ID, and item name. And that's working just as we want. And if I change this to say 200, oh, let's go. Before I do that, let's go make sure that that test passed. That test did in fact pass. That's excellent. And if I go ahead and change this to 201, we're expecting 200. It's going to respond to 100. We're saying that we're going to expect a 201, so this test should fail, and it does indeed fail. Expected 201, but got 200. So we know that our test will fail, so that is also good to know. And so if we go ahead and change that back, we can see that we've got a passing test. Okay, and so now let's try to get all of our orders back. So with this, we are doing a test to make sure that we get a status code 200 back. And if we run this test, we see that indeed we get all of our orders back, And if we look at our test results, we see that we get a status code 200 back. So that's great. And we can test this to see if this test will fail. So we are saying that we are expecting a 201 status code back, but in fact we're going to get a 200, so this test should fail. And indeed, we do get a failing test because we get the assertion error that we expected to get 201 but got 200. So if I change this back to 200, then we see that our test is passing again and all is good. All right, so moving right along. So for our update and order test, we're just expecting to get a response 200 back from our server. But a bit of a trick here, we are using the order ID that we set as a global variable before, and also we're sending a JSON body along with this request. So we've got our customer name and our item ID. You can have either the customer ID or the item ID or both, but you must send a JSON body back with this request. So let's go ahead in our tests and try sending this out. You can see that we are able to update an order, and as we kind of saw before, we're using Faker to generate a random customer name, and we're using the item ID that we have been using for our global variable. And really, we're not making a change here, but we still have to go through the same process in order to set this this quote unquote new ID. So even though the value isn't changing, if there's a problem, we'll still get an error with this test. So if we go into our tests, and we can see that this test is passing, we can try it again. It passes, and if we change it to something like 204, that way we don't expect to get a body back, then we see that this test is failing. So we'll go ahead and change this back to 200. So we have a passing test, and that's about it. And finally, for our delete and order test. So if we go into here, we're going to look at our tests, and we see that we're expecting a response 204 back from the server. So a status code 204 response back from the server. So, and also I do want to point out that I am using the order ID that we generated when we, this is a global variable that we created with our create an order request. So all of that is set up, and if I, try to run our test and go in here, I can see that I'm getting a 204 response back from the server, and say if I expect to get a 200 back, we're getting a 404. And that is because we just deleted that ID. So if we go back and we create a new order, and that's going to save a new value for our global variable. And if we go into our tests again, and let's say we should get a two 204 error or 204 response back, but we've set it as a 200. So let's see what happens. We are still failing this test. We were expecting to get a 200 back, but we got a 204 instead. And so if we change this back, and we'll also need to generate a new value for our order ID just to get this to work. So if we do that again, and now we've got a new value for our order ID, which is being passed in as a path variable. So if we run this again, we should get all of our tests passing. So that's great. Okay, and now for the moment we've been waiting for. We can actually do an automated run through of all of our tests with only clicking one button, say. So if we go to our runner, you can create basically an automated test sequence. And if we just drag in our automated tests, it's going to run, our runner is going to run through all the tests that we've created basically in this order. We'll want to save our responses, and then we run our tests. You can see that, yes, it looks like we have got all passing tests for our sequence. And so that is just awesome. Okay, so before I wrap things up, I just wanted to tell you about another feature in Postman that, is really pretty useful. It's the monitors feature. And you can go in and you can create a monitor for your test sequence. You can create the name, mention the collection, and then you can schedule when you want this monitor to run. And so automatically at the day and time that you specify, your monitor will run and it'll send you an email response with all the results that come back. Unfortunately, it won't work with the Bitty Baking API because it needs to be able to access a publicly available URL. But if you do have, a publicly available URL that you are testing, this is a great thing to know about. So just wanted to mention that before I wrap up. Okay, so that's about it. So we've run through a bunch of tests. We've run through the manual tests and automated testing. We've set up a runner, and we touched a bit on the monitor feature in Postman. So that is kind of it for the testing for our Bitty Baking API. I have links down below to the GitHub with the API code, as well as the Postman test that I've been running. So please feel free to check that out. And thanks so much for watching.